Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for coming. A warm welcome to the second seminar of Brown University's Middle East Studies Mellon Sawyer series on displacement. Bashar has just joined us, and as part of this year-long series of seminars, workshops, courses, and cultural activities, Displacement and the Making of the Modern World, we'll explore themes that integrate disparate studies of displacement in the modern world spanning the last 500 years. We are addressing three overarching themes. First, histories, displacement as a global and historically enduring phenomenon. Second, ecologies, displacement as an environmental and technological phenomenon. And third, subjectivities, displacement as an affective and discursive phenomenon. A common thread is a focus on displacement as formative of power relations of inclusion and exclusion. Today, we'll hear four presenters for the seminar, Dams and Displacement. Large dams in many ways have become the most visible ugly face of forced displacement caused by development projects. Gigantic in size, they are alternatively seen by planners as a source of assured irrigation and a source for generating power and many other uses, while for academics, particularly those in social sciences, as a source of massive displacement. Excuse me. Let us take a step back and look at what dams represent. Physically, at its most basic, a dam is a vault built to block a water body from flowing. This leads to a catchment area, i.e., the lake formed by the block river, and a command area, that is the area usually beyond the dam where the stored water is supplied for irrigation. Dams for blocking water is not a modern phenomenon or even restricted to human beings alone. Beavers make dams both as a protection from predators and for easy access to food during adverse conditions. Humans too have been making earth-filled and rock dams for centuries. The scale, size, and technology of modern dams is, however, unprecedented. Dams today are classified as small, i.e. those below the height of 50 feet, medium comprising of a height between 50 and 100 feet, and large dams are those above 100 feet. When we talk of dams and displacement in general, we are mostly dealing with large dams. That is also the theme for today's seminar. In many ways, the story of modern dam begins with Tennessee Valley Project of the US, created by a congressional charter on May 18, 1933. It included a series of large dams to provide navigation, flood control, electricity generation, fertilizer manufacture, and economic development in the Tennessee Valley. Assured irrigation and water for domestic and industrial consumption at all times, even during the dry season, is of course a crucial aspect of most dams. This project drew the attention of planners and governments across the world, including the newly independent countries of Asia and Africa that were the former colonies of Europe. Large dams became more than just a project, but came to represent an important symbol of modernity and progress. This can be best summed up in the words of post-colonial India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, who, while inaugurating one such large dam, called them, and I quote, the temples of modern India, unquote. So far, so good. But there was and remains a huge cost to be paid for those thousands of dams, both in terms of the human displacement that was recognized immediately and ecology that has been slowly realized in the more recent times. Historically, humans have lived close to rivers due to assured supply of water for drinking and for agriculture. From Nile in Egypt and Narmada in India to Euphrates in Turkey, river valleys have been the cradle of ancient civilizations and also housed some of the densest human habitation confined to a small area. Next to every river, big or small, lived hundreds and thousands of families whose lives and emotions have been shaped by that flowing water body. But now, suddenly, a dam enters the picture. As per the International Rivers Network, an NGO based in California, in the last 6 decades, dams have displaced between 40 to 80 million people across the world. The wide gap in this estimate is a reflection that there is no definite or concrete data maintained by most countries on dam-related displacements. Here, I'm not talking of the impact on the forest and aquatic life that gets affected due to the dam submerging a huge area or a river not being allowed to flow anymore. Even if we take the minimum figure of 40 million, it is a population that is nearly equal to the size of the entire population of California, and way more than the population of entire countries such as Canada or Argentina. Unlike civil wars, including the one that is presently raging in the Middle East, countries such as Syria or Jordan, resulting in thousands of refugees trying to somehow reach Europe, there is no hope of return back to the homeland. Once complete, displacement by a dam is permanent. Over time, planners and nation states faced with resistance and opposition realized that there is a serious human cost of dams that cannot simply be swept under the carpet in the name of some people paying a cost for development for the larger society. The issue of resettling the displaced people started becoming a part of the planning aspect itself. But can a community that has its life and culture based upon resources and a certain way of life living next to a river for generations ever recreate life, livelihood, and sociality away from it in a new setting? If so, what is lost in the process and how does life unfold in the new setting? Today, we'll be hearing what happens to life after dams in various parts of the world, ranging from North and South America, as well as Africa. We have a distinguished set of speakers comprising 2 anthropologists, a sociologist, and a planner from World Bank who will be sharing their experience of studying and planning the forced relocation of people in the wake of large dams. Let me introduce the 4 speakers. They'll be speaking in 2 sessions. The first session will have 2 speakers, followed by a break of 15 minutes, and then the second session will have 2 speakers. In the first session, the first speaker for today will be Dr. Dolores Koenig, followed by Vincent Roque, who works for the World Bank. In the second session, we'll be hearing papers by Dr. Joy Bilhars, an anthropologist, and Dr. Heather Randall, a sociologist. So let's get started with the first session. The keynote speaker is Dr. Dolores Koenig, Professor of Anthropology, Department of Anthropology, American University, Washington, D.C. Dolores is a specialist in international development, interested both in its challenges as well as its successes. She is especially interested in finding new ways of talking about development and social change that value the experiences of local people while still taking into account the international context of global inequalities. She works primarily on issues of development-caused forced displacement and resettlement, both urban and rural, in French-speaking West Africa. She worked on relocation in conjugation with dam construction in Western Mali, and is now looking at development-caused urban displacement in West Africa and Asia. Her paper is titled, Issues in Development-Caused Forced Relocation, the Manatali Dam 30 Years After Resettlement. Over to Dolores.
Well, that's it. That's it, the Manatali Dam. I would like very much to thank the Middle East Studies Program and Brown University for inviting me to come and talk today. I'm just going to, here's West Africa. The Manatali Dam is down here. it's on the Bafing River, which is a tributary of the Senegal, which runs along here. This is important. This is not a Malian activity. It's an activity of the Senegal River Basin Authority, which includes the countries of Mauritania, Senegal, and Mali, and now Guinea. The dam had three purposes: electricity, production of electricity, irrigation, but irrigation primarily in Mauritania and Senegal, and also the creation of a port in Mali, an internal port, which, as far as I can figure out, will never get built because it's too environmentally destructive. Dam construction was funded by multiple donors, the most important of which were Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Germany. The resettlement project about which I'm going to talk today was funded by the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. In 1979, USAID decided to assist Monontelli resettlement. It had earlier been involved in Senegal River Basin activity, but was not building the dam because at that point in time it did not invest in infrastructure. The design was created in 1983 and 1984. In August 1984, the U.S. government approved financing of the resettlement part, and the Malian government created what came to be known as the PRM, the Project for the Resettlement of Monontelli, which was a branch of the Ministry of Water and Power. The PRM was the principal implementing agency of the resettlement, and its staff were assisted by technical assistance provided by USAID funding, and I served as kind of a social science expert intermittently on this project. By June 1985, the field staff were at Monontelli. In 1986, slightly less than half the residents moved. In 1987, the remainder of the population moved, although housing construction was not finished until 1988. At that time, a separate contract was given to a Malian research institute, the Institut des Sciences Humaines, or Institute for Human Sciences, to do a study of the domestic economy, in essence, to follow the people who had been resettled over the first couple years. This resettlement took place before the World Bank created its policy on involuntary resettlement, or before it published its policy on involuntary resettlement. The first World Bank policy was created in 1980, but the first publicly available document about it didn't appear until 1988. Therefore, that policy as such was not available to the planners at Monontelli in 82-84. Nonetheless, social scientists already knew a lot about the potential negative and impoverishing consequences of forced resettlement, and the project design team made efforts to avoid them. Crucial was the involvement of Thayer Scudder, who had extensively worked on forced and voluntary resettlement before then. Resettlement thinking has obviously evolved since then. Among other things, Michael Chernia has codified his thinking about resettlement into what has come to be called a risks and reconstruction framework. Basically, you identify the risk, and then once you know what this risk is, you put in something in place to avoid it or mitigate it. Because reference to these risks has become a standard element in discussion of local level outcomes of involuntary resettlement, I'm actually going to use it to structure this paper. Although the list was created after Monontelli resettlement occurred, it was based on the synthesis of previous social science ideas that were already there. And this is just a brief outline. I've talked a little bit about the Monontelli Dam. I'm going to talk a little bit about what was done in the actual early implementation, and then I'm going to look at 30 years later, looking at Malian development in the interim and livelihoods in 2016. The Monontelli region, called the Bafing after the river that was dammed, was a prime candidate for impoverishment if corrective action in the form of a resettlement project was not undertaken. The Malinke of the Bafing River Valley, also called Bafingwa to differentiate them from many other Malinke groups, was a very isolated group of peasant farmers who mainly lived through extensive agriculture. And by extensive agriculture, I mean that their major means of maintaining soil fertility were through relatively long-term fallowing rather than the use of either organic or chemical fertilizers. Thus, a normal farm included not only the land under cultivation, but a lot of other other land in fallow. Although the Baffing Law produced most of what they ate, they were integrated into cash crop production in the Malian state through an agricultural extension agency called Odimo that focused on the production of peanuts for export. They had minimal representation of other Malian state institutions. There was an arrondissement head named by the central government, and the state provided a few primary schools and minimal health services. There were no all-weather roads, primarily what you're seeing here, and no permanent markets in the zone. So Michael Chernia identifies 8 primary risks to groups subject to involuntary resettlement: economic risks, social risks, and health risks. And I'm going to talk about them by group. First, I'll talk about the economic risks, of which there are 3. The first risk is landlessness, and basically you deal with it by providing land to people resettled. And then, well, I'll say what the risk is, and then I'll talk about what happened in the Manantali project. The resettlement project provided land to the relocatees, 0.8 hectares for each active adult, basically defined as everyone between the ages of 15 and 55. Thus, the amount of land that a household received varied with the size of the household. Few issues were clear from the beginning. The figure was calculated based upon measures of the amount of land under cultivation at the time the pre-resettlement studies were done, and took only minimal account of the need for fallow in this extensive system. And therefore, it assumed that people could easily expand the land they cultivated, since there was seemingly so much empty land surrounding the resettlement site. That was true. But the project took little account of the ownership status of the land. In Western Mali, all land is customarily owned, and it's under the control of a particular village that claims ownership. There were no title deeds, and there still are basically no title deeds. Risk 2 is joblessness, and basically you deal with that by creating employment. People were defined by the project as basically independent farmers with their own land. They also defined themselves in this way, and virtually no attention was paid to jobs. But I'll just say here that wasn't really a problem, and I'm not going to return to it. Risk 3 is loss of access to common property and services. And basically you deal with that by restoring common property and restoring services. Now, I'd like to make a note that Chernia's reformulation of this has varied over time. His initial emphasis was on common property, and it's now moved to talking about community assets and services, and poor common property just disappeared. Now, common property was very important here, and the main form of common property was open and forested bush, used to provide grazing for livestock and access to wild foods, particularly shea nuts, and fuel wood. The project plan had basically the same kind of attitude toward common property as it had toward new agricultural land. Oh, there's all this land here, and people should just be able to use it, and it shouldn't be a problem. But again, there was the ownership problem, and did people have the rights to use it? At the same time, community assets and services were extremely low before resettlement. And the project did reconstruct existing schools and government buildings, primarily the arrondissement office and medical clinic. Staffing, such as it was maintained throughout the project by the Malian government. The resettlement project provided no extra staffing. 1 additional school was built. So, a significant part of the project was the reconstruction of economic resources needed for livelihoods. This was defined narrowly as agricultural land and reconstruction of community assets. Advantages to the way things were done were that households could continue livelihood strategies of agriculture similar to those they had used in the old sites. Land allocations were larger than in many projects, were based on pre-resettlement studies, and varied according to household size. Compensation was also given for some things not reconstructed, such as fruit trees and granaries. The following problems were exhibited, however. First, there was a lack of attention to the multiple resources used by households, so that attention was focused uniquely on agricultural cropland. Different kinds of land used for vegetable gardens and fruit trees was not taken into account, nor were livestock grazing needs, nor were any non-agricultural activities even counted. Second, a lack of attention to the political forms used to regulate allocation of land for farming and grazing. Project designers saw a lot of free land, although the project negotiated with existing host villages, that's what you call the people who are already living there, in the project area. Initial village and field allocations, the assumption was that villagers could themselves negotiate for additional fields or grazing land. Third, there was little, if any, reflection on how the Monontelli area might change with dam construction, in particular, how it might be integrated more substantially into the national economy. There was little training for future opportunities, either agricultural or non-agricultural. The second set of risks is social risks. There are two of these. The first risk is social disarticulation, addressed by rebuilding communities. The Monontelli project moved villages as units. Village leadership structures, village chiefs and their councils were formally consulted by the project in different negotiations. Local government structures remained in place and active throughout the project. Risk two is marginalization and moving from marginalization to social inclusion. Again, this was not paid a whole lot of attention to, but marginalization mostly seems to occur among hierarchized groups where the wealthy are able to monopolize the project benefits, so the gap between wealthy and poor becomes bigger. And indigenous peoples also may be particularly negatively hit. The people of the Bafing were neither terribly hierarchical nor ethnically marginalized. And it wasn't thought of, but it wasn't a major issue either. In terms of social risks, the Monontelli resettlement did well by the simple fact of moving villages as villages, which kept their names and governance structures. Much social structure was preserved. Because they kept local authority, villages and individuals had the freedom to adapt to new conditions that arose later. The third category of risks is health, what I'm calling health risks. It's kind of more social servicey in any case. Risk one is homelessness, and you solve that by building housing. One of the major project activities, and actually the major project cost, was building new housing. The housing conformed to existing housing in form and layout. Again, households received a number of houses that corresponded to their family size. Risk number two is food insecurity, dealing with by providing adequate nutrition. World Food Program food was provided for 2 years to relocatees, and it was expected that in that 2-year period they would be able to get their new fields completely cleared and into production. And that's World Food Program deliveries on the right. Risk three is increased morbidity and mortality resolved by improved health care. Levels of morbidity and mortality were not tracked systematically, but the project carried out vaccination campaigns against infectious diseases before people were moved. This was considered especially important since people would be leaving relative isolated sites for a dam construction area that had workers from many different countries, bringing many different germs with them. On this third set of risks, the project did relatively well. It could have done more to implement programs for long-term health care, but over the long term, health conditions do not seem to be a major issue. Some other issues were raised and aren't necessarily included directly in these 8 risks. Discussions with the resettled pointed to another major resource used by people, water, which for some reason doesn't show up in Chernya's list. But was already mentioned by Vikram. The vast majority of villages who moved had been sited along the Bafing River. People had easy access to water. They also had access to alluvial fields. When they were resettled, villages were sited away from the river and provided with pump-driven wells. You can see that's the standard Malian well. I lost my place. Oh, yeah. Water was more sanitary, although it was less abundant. The wells also had to be maintained, and villages struggled to organize and pay for effective pump repairs. But I think the bottom line is that the overarching goal of the World Bank guidelines for involuntary resettlement is to improve or at least maintain people's livelihoods through resettlement carried out as a sustainable development project. Notably, although the Monontelli Resettlement Project paid attention to the major risks identified by Chernia, it was not conceived of as a sustainable development project to improve people's lives. There was little to no investment in the future. The major investment was to maintain what people had in terms of basic economic resources, administrative access, and housing. The planning for the project did not include long-term investment in the Monontelli zone. The majority of project funds were meant to be spent in 3 or 4 years, and major project activities were meant to end once people had physically moved. Any future development would have to depend on local, national, or another donor's resources. It quickly became clear that the national terrain was changing significantly, which I'll talk about below. It also became clear that both agriculture and grazing lands were not sufficient to carry on extensive farming and grazing. They needed a lot of fallow, which they did not have. Separate from the USAID-funded project, there was a plan to build a 680 perimeter on the left bank of the Bafing below the dam, and some villages had chosen to move to that area precisely to get access to that land. However, due to lack of funding, the perimeter was not built until 2007, nearly 20 years after the resettlement occurred. So now I'm going to talk about what some of the major things that happened in the interim in this part of, basically mostly in the whole country, but particularly in how they affected this part of the country, which had nothing to do with the resettlement. Many changes have occurred in Mali, and I'm going to just discuss them a little bit one by one. No photos of these. So the first major change is structural adjustment. In the early 1980s, structural adjustment programs aimed at liberalizing economic systems grew in West Africa. The beginnings of structural adjustment were felt at the time of the Monontelli project was being designed, but substantial effects did not reach Mali until the late 1980s after the resettlement occurred. One of the major targets of structural adjustment in Mali was the Integrated Rural Development Operations, or fancy name for the Agricultural Extension Services, which covered most of the country's agricultural regions. After the 1970s drought, earlier, funding to these operations from external donors had increased. Most of the operations offered inputs and equipment to farmers on credit and then provided an assured market to them at a fixed producer price. Except in the case of a few crops, the rural development operations were not financially sustainable without substantial and regular injections of donor funding. This was the case for Odimo, the rural development operation that had supported peanut cultivation in the Bafing. Moreover, the viability of export peanut cultivation was strongly affected by world market conditions. In the late 1980s, the world market price for peanuts fell due to competition from other vegetable oils as well as growth in the Chinese production already. Moreover, by the early 2000s, increasing European regulation of aflatoxins found in a fungus that affects stored peanuts also made it harder for African countries to export. Thus, Odimo's main donors, the World Bank and the French, began to reconsider support, and Odimo gradually decreased activities and eventually it was abolished. This left Monontelli relocatees, mostly farmers without access to fertilizer and other inputs that would allow them to intensify their use of land. This led ultimately to increasing tension with neighborhood host villages about the use of land beyond that initially allocated by the project. Structural adjustment also theoretically meant that government services were pulled back. However, in pre-resettlement isolated Monontelli, government services were already minimal. For example, a pre-resettlement visit to the health center showed virtually no medication and minimally trained personnel. So in much of rural Mali, there was little, if anything, to pull back. At the same time, the legalization of privatization opened up the terrain to private entrepreneurs in human health and veterinary services, for example. Government agencies were also allowed to charge for commodities and other things. In the context of overall development, the availability of services at Monontelli has increased since resettlement, even though much of the stuff comes with some user fees. This was especially evident in the provision of health care and primary schools. Localities build multi-purpose clinics, known as SESCOMs, where people need to pay for some services and prescription medications. Several have been built in the Monticelli zone, and many people use them despite the fees. There has also been rapid growth in the number of primary schools, and the government encourages some community addition to schools and teachers. Thus, most students pay a nominal fee for tuition, about $1 a month, to pay for these things. The second major change that happened in Mali was democratization. During the Monticelli resettlement, Mali was governed by a one-party system controlled by the apparatus of President Moussa Traoré, who himself had come to power in a coup in 1968. In 1991, a second coup in Mali ousted his government. In 1992, a new constitution was adopted and presidential elections were held, with the election of Alpha Oumar Konaré as the first post-transition president. Konaré adopted a policy of decentralization and further democratization, which led to the creation of local communes with elected officials to kind of replace the existing arrondissement structure with someone appointed head by the Ministry of the Interior. Since the mid-1990s, the Monticelli zone has had 2 communes, both comprised primarily, although not exclusively, of resettlement villages. Konaré also encouraged villages to build a school in every village and increased schooling overall. The number of schools and people with some schooling has grown. The region now has several middle schools, 7th to 9th grade, as well as many more primary schools. Students must still leave the zone to go to high school or for higher education. The third major change involves transport and communication. Despite structural adjustment, Mali has embarked on a program of increased road building in the last 10 to 20 years. Western Mali had been very poorly served by all-weather roads, much less paved roads, before the 1980s. The country embarked on the construction of paved roads from Bamako and to major cities in the west. This included, in the early 2000s, a paved road between Bamako and Kita, a major town about halfway between Bamako and Manantali. Although the dam construction company had built an all-weather road north from Manantali to the provincial center and railroad station, this was paved several years ago, so now there's also a paved road 90 kilometers to the north. Road access, first through dam construction and then through national initiatives, facilitated transport throughout the region. Local markets grew. A number of resettled villages created markets. One of the largest is in one of the commune centers. Manantali itself has a large daily market, and improved transport has made access to more distant markets easier. The number of village-level small shops and vendors has also increased. Cell service was first introduced in Mali in the mid-1900s, and the number of users increased in the 2000s. At first, service was limited since there were insufficient cell towers, but the phone companies built cell towers, and many areas of the country are now covered, and this includes Manantali, where the majority of resettled villages have at least some cell coverage. For the access to regular transport and communication has allowed for greater integration among villages, between village residents and immigrants, and between local people and national and even international centers. Some other changes that affected Manantali, the provision of electricity. This photo was taken at the power plant. By the mid-1980s, the river basin, when the dam was finished, the River Basin Authority still only had funds to build the dam and didn't have commitments for construction and putting into service the power plant. Thus, electricity generation was quite delayed, and electricity was not produced and distributed until 2001, more than 10 years after the dam was actually built. So there you are, sitting there. And then the villages themselves didn't get electrified till this summer. And probably not yet. The lines were being put in this summer. Second major change was population growth. This was first seen 5 to 7 years directly after the resettlement. What did people do with the compensation money? They used it to pay bride wealth for marriages of young men. What happened after the young men got married? Babies were born. The population growth seems to have continued. People still rely on children for a major part of their labor force and for old age security. We can only hypothesize that the improvement in local health care, as well as more centrally located hospitals and national vaccination programs, have lessened infant and child mortality. The rates for Mali, the national rates for Mali are still pretty bad, but we think that the population, that kids are doing pretty well in Monotali. We roughly estimate, and this is a real rough estimate, that the population in the zone probably has quadrupled in the 30 years since resettlement. If people had sufficient resources when they resettled, those resources are surely being stressed by the larger population now. The other change, or maybe it's the lack of change, is agricultural development programs. These remain understaffed and insufficient for the needs. As part of planning for the dam, plans were made for this gravity-fed perimeter that I talked about. It did go into, it wasn't open for cultivation until 2007, nearly 20 years after resettlement. It's 680 hectares and is insufficient to meet the needs of all 8,000 relocatees of Monotali, many of whom live too far away from it anyway. Therefore, most of the resettlement population continued to depend upon rain-fed agriculture. The government provided a few extension agents, but people said they had little contact with them. One remaining rural development organization, the CMDT, which concentrates on export cotton production, attempted to move into the zone in the mid-2000s as part of a general expansion into western Mali. However, people were not willing to meet the stringent terms of repayment of CMDT loans, and the CMDT left the area a few years later, giving up on repayment, but saying they weren't going to give any more loans to people. Arguably, once the residents at Monotali had moved, they were treated like Malians in any part of the Southwest. The resettlement villages are virtually indistinguishable from other villages in the zone, and the major changes that I just talked about affected all villages in southern Mali. So now, not quite, but I'm going to move to looking at livelihoods and standards in 2016. And the information I'm going to present was based on fieldwork in June and July 2016 in a sample of about 120 households, followed by different segments of the research team in the 1980s, 1993, and 4, and again now. The study was carried out by 5 social scientists, basically from here left, 4 Malians and myself. This man and I both worked earlier, and the other 3 are younger scholars who are working on Monotali for the first time. Obviously, some household heads have died in the interim, but villagers identified inheriting households for us to follow. Although there is outmigration, almost all households have an identified heir living in the zone. And we also stratified by older people versus younger people to look at the reactions between people who had lived in the old sites and those who either hadn't lived in the old sites or didn't remember. And we still have more field work to do. You're like the first people who are hearing any of these results. People had very strong ideas about the resettlement. Many talked as if it happened yesterday. Many thought it was a bad thing, and they romanticized life in the old Bafing Valley. But I'm also taken by the more objective criteria as well as these evaluations. So I'm going to talk again about livelihoods, because if people don't have livelihoods, their ability to get the means of survival and to achieve their goals will be compromised. Monotali residents still consider themselves to be primarily farmers and evaluate their livelihoods in terms of those criteria. Their idea is that they're not successful if they don't have a granary with a year's full of grain in it. People don't and cannot rely on rain-fed crop agriculture. They have done 2 different things to get more land. They try to borrow land from neighboring villages who aren't really keen on lending land to them. It also creates a relationship of dependency with the neighboring villages, which they don't want to do. So a safer strategy is to create what is called an agricultural hamlet, a field in the bush some 10 or 20 kilometers away in a relatively uncultivated zone, often in an area where the owner village is not using it anyway. And lots of people have created hamlets. People have also moved their farms to the irrigated perimeter when when they are close to it. However, there's a lot of disappointment because there were some design problems, and it's hard to do a second dry season crop, which is kind of what makes an irrigated perimeter worthwhile. There's also continued problems with livestock production. The major strategy that people have used to compensate for agricultural problems is to increase the amount of non-agricultural activities very substantially, primarily through the emigration of youth. Many go to work in the gold fields in Western Mali, in artisanal gold mining, and almost every household had some young male member at the gold fields. Other youth migrate overseas. People in the zone have gone to Equatorial Guinea, Congo, Libya, Italy, Spain, Algeria, and Michigan. One in Michigan. Young men who do artisanal gold mining are expected to return home during the agricultural season and assist with farming. Some do, not all, but other migrants are away more indefinitely. People also develop non-agricultural activities in place. There were lots of people doing commerce, numerous women who bought in local markets and then sold in the village. Others bought bigger things like wine, one lady sold wine, and fertilizer and resold in the village. Others did small stores, and there were also regional livestock and crop sellers. People also did a number of small village projects. They worked for savings banks, a Sesame Project extension agents, cereal banks. They took skills learned working on the dam and got work as independent contractors, such as electrical work or metal work. One village close to the dam has a lot of people who are security guards at Monantali. There were school directors and school teachers and other things. It's impossible to get estimates of income, but we did look at consumer goods. It was rare to find households where no one had a cell phone. This old guy, here's a cell phone down here. And all the other pictures are from Monantali. These aren't Monantali, but you could find them at Monantali. Lots of people have bought solar panels. Then they get a battery. The first thing they use it for is to charge their cell phones. The second thing they use it for is to watch TV. And if they really want to watch TV, you'd go through a village with all these traditional houses, and there's this parabolic antenna sitting in there. Not a lot of people had those, but a significant minority did. Living standards were higher. I think health standards were higher. We didn't do a systematic health study, but we observed very few malnourished children, like less than 5, and all the kids we saw were obviously malnourished. Most people reported eating 3 meals a day. And if we look at the census and you look at birth intervals between children, they're quite regular, which suggests that not many have died. The people at Monantali were also more integrated into the national political economy, for better or for worse. This is an attestation that one village paid their taxes. This is a new mosque that they're building. This is a school that they built, which is not in good shape because it's the beginning of the rainy season and the rains have gotten at it, the winds have gotten at it, and the livestock have gotten at it. But they'll rebuild it when school starts again. They're trying to get more money so that they could build. Villagers who have schools like this are always trying to get more funds so they can build in cement block rather than like this. But these schools these schools work. And people also entered national networks through religious institutions. They became more observant Muslims in the new sites. Although most would have said they were Muslim in the old sites, there were no mosques, really. And now most villages have built a mosque, and then people know who the major national preachers are, and they listen to them on the radio or TV. Islam offers a way to participate in national conversations independent for the state. And people were also just generally politically active with the commune. Several people in our sample identified themselves as politicians, and some of them had been former members of the communal council. We had 2 deputy mayor families in our sample, and so on. People complained when, that their communes didn't always work in their interest. They complained that their taxes are too high, but they wanted them to work better. They didn't want to pull out of the system. In conclusion, so the bottom line is, in some ways people are better off, in some ways they're worse off than they were 30 years before they were resettled. But the ways in which they are worse off, to me at least, don't seem to me to have a lot to do with the resettlement. They are the result of processes going on all over southwestern Mali. For example, the rates of emigration to the goldfields are very high all over southwestern Mali. The rates of emigration overseas to those very countries I named are pretty high all over Mali. And so what I'm arguing is that over the last 30 years, the changes that occurred in Mali's larger polity and economy have begun to play a much more significant role in the opportunities available to them rather than the resources that they had at the end of the resettlement. Now, they had kind of a minimum, if they had nothing, the case might have been different, but they had a minimum threshold of resources with which to start a new life. And I think the other thing that's crucially important is that they kept their social capital and they kept their social organization so that they could use that to make arguments for more investment, for essentially political action, not necessarily informal politics, but for making arguments for getting more resources of various kinds. I'll stop there.
So Vincent will be presenting for the next 35 minutes. His paper is titled Integrating Social Issues into Hydropower Project Planning, Lessons from Rusumo Fall Project, Rwanda and Tanzania, and La Granda Project, North Quebec. Over to Vincent. Thank you.
So I thank you for inviting me here. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I look forward to exchanging and answering questions you might have after my presentation. Let's see if I put it on. Yeah. Let's see. Slideshow?
Yeah.
Here?
Yeah.
Okay, up here should work also then. Nope, it'll be down here. This one?
Yeah,
Okay, I got it.
perfect.
Okay. So basically what I have here is two presentations. I was asked by Professor Vikram to make a presentation on planning approaches for hydropower projects. And so I wanted to present two types of planning approaches that are currently used to develop big hydro projects. One that's based on a case study in the Upper Nile Basin in East Africa. And that's essentially a hydropower project that's currently under construction on the border of Rwanda and Tanzania. So I worked on the studies for that project from the very beginning of upstream planning all the way down to construction. So I wanted to walk you through the process, which is quite interesting both from a technical, environmental, and social perspective and from a political perspective, an institutional perspective. It's a very political process. And the second presentation is more on the planning of recent planning of hydropower projects based on rather than going to the upstream planning process, is building on monitoring programs, on a long-term post-project assessment, a bit similar to the presentation we've just seen on the Manantali Dam, but that was done in Quebec on the whole James Bay hydropower complex in collaboration with indigenous communities to draw lessons from problems of the past to better plan for the future. So it's two presentations that are linked on how to plan hydropower projects and based on recent hydropower developments that I was involved in. So the first approach to planning the Rusumo Falls project, which is actually an 80 megawatt hydropower project on the border of Rwanda and Tanzania, was actually supported by upstream planning. It was based on strategic, sectoral, social, and environmental assessment of power generation options in the Upper Nile Basin. So basically, the fundamental problem when you're doing an environmental and social assessment for a hydropower project and you go into public consultations and you debate the project, The first question is, why are you doing this project? It's the whole question of the justification. Why are you doing a hydropower project and not doing solar or doing a wind project, right? Or why do you want to destroy this environment? Why don't you go destroy the environment somewhere else, right? So that's the fundamental question in public consultations on hydropower projects when you're developing them. And so one of the ways to address that is actually to study those upstream questions. What is the best project? What is the best type of project, the best location? And so this is what the strategic study that was carried out it was in the 6 countries at the top of the Nile Basin. It was a study that looked at 200 possible different power projects in the basin, based on a number of, plenty of studies that had been carried out on possible hydropower projects on different rivers, possible thermal projects, gas projects, solar projects, different types of options. And they were all analyzed on the basis of their technical value, their cost benefit, their environmental impact, their social resettlement impact, and all compared to one another. So you could say that could be, in the past, these type of studies are done by engineers and power planners. They're called least cost planning studies. They're often done in-house, right? So the idea of a strategic assessment is to actually do this with the public. Bring in the stakeholders from the different countries that are actually interested in these questions and open up the discussion. So this strategic assessment was conducted for an agency called NELSAP, which is the Nile Equatorial Lakes Structural Assistance Program or something like that. That was set up under an embryonic river basin agency called the Nile Basin Initiative that covers the 10 countries of the Nile Basin. They basically, who is NELSAP? They're basically composed of representatives of the Ministry of Water Resources of each of these 10 countries, right? So NELSAP covered 6 countries with water resources specialists. And the strategic assessment was conducted, the first stage was conducted in Burundi, Rwanda, and Tanzania in 2003, 2004. It was funded with the assistance of the World Bank and the Canadian Development Agency, International Development Agency. And the reason why it was done in 2 stages, the first stage was basically an emergency strategic assessment because there was a perception at the time that Burundi and Rwanda and Western Tanzania were practically disconnected from the power grid and had the most urgent needs for power. And then it was extended to the other countries of the Upper Nile Basin in a second stage, right? The Democratic Republic of Congo, Kenya, and Uganda. There is experimentation on methods, what's known as multi-criteria analysis methods. So you put all the information on each project into different systems where you're comparing projects on the basis of technical, environmental, social data. And there were additional complementary studies that were funded by the World Bank, including looking at institutional, environmental, social capacity of the different countries that I was working on also in 2007. So that's a bit the background. Where this is, you know where the Upper Nile Basin is, the context. Essentially, also, part of the assessment wasn't just looking at power generation per se, producing power, but also the question was how would it be connected to the power transmission and how would it be connected to eventually supplying different centers that would need this power. So a big part of the study was looking at potential power transmission backbones, places where you could build a power plant that could serve as a basis for supplying power, a little bit like Manantali we were just talking about earlier in Mali, which actually supplies Senegal and Guinea and Mauritania. So it's the idea of developing power transmission backbones. That was part of the study also. SSE approach, basically what it involves is you look at the inventory of options, you do a screening of options, you do the comparative analysis of options, the ranking of options, defining after strategies based on these options, and you have different parallel things to it. So you have a regional power needs assessment, you look at policy, legal, administrative reviews, and you do a selection of different portfolios of options that can be considered. So you're not just planning one project out of this, but you're planning a series of projects on a regional basis that makes sense for future funding. A big part of the whole process, and I was responsible for this part of the strategic assessment, was stakeholder participation. So for this, what we had to do, the challenge, we had to bring in stakeholders to participate in the discussions at a regional level, so representative of different countries. They had to be sufficiently representative to be to have a legitimate process, but they had to be sufficiently few that you could have a discussion around a table and not, end up in a chaotic situation. They had to have a sufficient amount of knowledge to be able to discuss with power generation engineers, etc. So that the approach is that we selected a number of representatives of environmental socioeconomic NGOs, international NGOs, faith-based organizations, academic institutions, and relevant government ministries and agencies. So that basically, in concrete terms, we had national stakeholder workshops, and we would have 8 to 9 representatives from among the 4 categories. But we'd end up for the stage 1, we had a total of 15 representatives of the first 3 countries, and the second stage we had 30 representatives in stage 2. They were English and French speaking, so we had translation. Also, there were representatives of Uganda, Congo, Rwanda, who we had to work very carefully in seating arrangements that fights wouldn't break out. There was a lot of social activities to try and encourage people to have a constructive approach. Bringing in representatives from Eastern DRC was quite challenging. Just for them to get there was quite a challenge. You'd have a person whose trip had been funded by 100 local NGOs, that one person. And so they had their specific demands as part of the process. Also, it's quite interesting. So, what were these participants doing? They were contributing to the inventory and screening of power options, the regional power needs assessment, the identification of criteria, risks, and indicators for the comparison of power options, the weighting of criteria and risks, and the review of the results. They could comment on the results of the evaluations. They also contributed to the definition of a regional power development plan, of strategies for the selection of power investment portfolios, and to the assessment of cumulative impact. So they had a role to play all throughout the process. Maybe one point also is that actually selecting and identifying these representative groups, NGOs, was proved to be quite challenging. In many cases, the governments would be opposed to the choices we were proposing. So we would give, say, 2 or 3 choices and allow the government to make one out of the 3, select one out of the 3. And we had negotiations, for example, in Uganda with the International Rivers Network, with different groups who would agree that if the government was totally opposed to them participating, they would get agreement that the green lawyers who were suing the government would participate as an NGO. It was an interesting process, right? Just getting agreement on who was a stakeholder representative. There was an information disclosure process with the SSEA website. There were dissemination of information bulletins before and after workshops, making use of information sharing networks in the Nile Basin, and summary reports that we're producing. So we put a lot of effort into communications. So the outcomes, there was, out of all this process, there was a relatively wide buy-in from national and regional stakeholders on the results of the SSEA, agreement on a regional power development plan, agreement on regional strategies, and a regional consensus on priority power projects such as Bujagali and Rusumo Falls, including a few controversial projects such as Bujagali. Going through the process, everyone agreed that they were better off than all the other options, right? So this led us to go back to my previous slide, the priority project that had been identified out of the screening of these 200 projects was Rusumo Falls, because it was perceived as the best project in which to invest to support a power transmission backbone connected to Rwanda, Burundi, and Western Tanzania. There was a lot of mining that was not connected to the power transmission grid. And I also worked on the planning and the studies for Rusumo Falls, which came out of the strategic assessment. And this is basically, you see a picture of the dam. The dam site is basically at the bridge that separates Rwanda from Tanzania. And the river here is the Akagera River. Where during the genocide in Rwanda, there are many bodies floating down here. It's well known by journalists during the genocide in Rwanda. The dam site location, so on the border. So the first stage of studies to plan the Rusumo Falls project, there was a feasibility study that combined both engineering and environmental and social analysis. I was responsible for what's known as the RAP and Local Area Development Plan, basically the resettlement plan and a local area economic development plan, because the Rusumo Falls project was located in the poorest part of Burundi, of Rwanda, and of Tanzania. So it's really a pocket of extreme poverty that had been heavily hit by genocides, in particular in Burundi and Rwanda. So that a big focus of the project was actually making use of the power project to enable local communities to grow, to benefit from the project. So it was a big effort on economic development through the project. And there was an environmental impact assessment. So this was what was related to the hydropower project was funded by the World Bank, and there was separate funding for the transmission lines funded by the African Development Bank. So this is something you often face on development projects, internationally funded development projects. You have separate donors who have to work together and coordinate also. That's a challenge. So there were 3 alternatives that were under study at that stage for Rusumo Falls. There was the ideal project from the perspective of the countries concerned, was what was known as the full development scheme, of the reservoir going up the river and even raising the level of a big lake at the top of the scheme. You had an intermediary or scheme and a run-of-river scheme, which is basically without a reservoir, right? And they all had their advantages and disadvantages. I'll skip these, just show you a bit of picture of the concept of development of the dam. It also included managing an environmental flow. We were talking about the concept of creating a dam that you shut off the river. Well, actually, the way you manage that is through ensuring an environmental flow and maintaining a minimum flow of water downstream of the dam to protect the environment, which is now modern standard practice. A visual simulation of the dam site after construction in the case of the run-of-river option. This is a map of the river. So what was interesting, you see the dam site down here. It was a very flat river. That included a lot of marshlands along the river, and with marshland agriculture. So you see these 2 maps, the 3 maps. There's the lower reaches, the middle reaches. On the top side is Rwanda. The bottom side here is Burundi. And finally, Lake Ruweru, which is at the top of the system, right? So it's with a sort of natural reservoir at the top of the Akagera River. So the challenges for the studies, when we were put in charge of doing these studies, apart from taking into consideration the fact that it was in a traumatized area because of the genocide in Rwanda and also in Burundi, there is a lack of recent detailed topo maps of the impoundment zone. There is a lack of recent historic socioeconomic census data in all 3 countries, compounded by the recent territorial reorganization in Rwanda. Poorly documented migratory movements in all 3 countries. There's ongoing return of refugees, of internally displaced populations. There are refugee camps where people would be living at night and would come out in the day to farm in their fields, while people had taken over their houses during the genocide was still living in their houses with a gun, so they couldn't go back home. So you had all these different situations. There was very low institutional capacity and education levels in the study area, affecting the quality of survey data. There are instabilities in parts of the study area. In Burundi, around Lake Ruweru, when we traveled around Lake Ruweru to study the area, the Burundian military threw us out. It was in a conflict zone. And there were restricted access to parts of the study area in Tanzania also. The main sources of livelihoods is mainly subsistence farming. Both men and women occupied were occupied most of the year in agriculture on hillsides and in river marshlands. The big difference with the Malian context we were talking about earlier, we're talking about very small plots on the hillside. So a factor in the genocide was actually the very small size of the plots that contributed to a lot of deaths also. Fishing was an important occupation, livestock breeding, some commerce, and the fields were very small in most cases. So this is a picture of marshland agriculture in the Akagera River. In Rwanda and Burundi, these areas that were cultivated at low river, at the period of low water, they're in public areas where both governments would consider this as an illegal activity. But when we talked to Rwandan officials, they'd explain to us, we tell these people this is illegal, but if they farm illegally, they should cultivate rice. We insist on that, right? So it was both an illegal and recognized activity. And for the farmers who were farming on the hillsides, it was a way to compensate for the very small size of the plots on the hillside to have this additional activity. So if you're going to flood the Akagera River, you're also flooding these marshlands that are used for agriculture, right? Another problem we had during these first 2 years of the studies is because it was very flat, we weren't able to obtain this very detailed information as to what would be flooded out and what would not be flooded out. So we had approximate information. The only way to be able to get detailed information was to carry out what's known as LiDAR surveys. So passing over with a plane, taking detailed laser topographical measurements to be able to really define where exactly those white lines are, right, to see who would be affected. So that took a while. So the World Bank actually wasn't part of the initial studies. They agreed to fund these LiDAR surveys as an additional study. It took a year to be able to get it done because it took practically a year to get the permits from the military of the three countries to overfly the zone and do LiDAR surveys. So it's part of the complications. So this comes from the LiDAR surveys, basically showing what's known as the impoundment zone, the reservoir area would be. Living conditions close to the dam site. These are people who were living close to the dam. This is one of my photos when I was there. Fishing village on Lake Ruweru. On the full development scheme, certain of these villages would be flooded out with the rising water levels in the lake. Fishermen in the lake were facing declining fish catches. You see more and more small nets, or what we call mosquito net fishing, with the potential impact eventually of there being no more fish in the lake. Local water supply, some NGOs were building some projects such as this. There's basically extreme poverty, in particular around Lake Ruweru, where you see children running around with no clothes because actually they had no clothes. Also, there's a lot of use of local vegetation for housing, make mats, etc. So the marshlands were not only areas to grow food, but also to grow various products for commerce. So when we did the initial analysis for the first 2 years, we looked at what the impacts would be for each country, for each development option. So that could contribute to the discussion of what is the best project, what is the best design of the project. So evidently the run-of-river option had relatively few impacts in Burundi, in Rwanda, and in Tanzania. So this is looking at flooded lands and flooded built-up areas. And then we also were looking at affected households, in particular in a context of these countries that have just gone through a genocide, extremely tense areas. If you looked at the full development option without having our LiDAR survey analysis, we still could estimate if the full development option were developed, you'd be affecting at least between 5,200 to 6,700 households. And that's excluding the marshland areas, where we actually had no idea at the time how many households were cultivating there. So we knew it was much more. The intermediary option was 3,000 to 4,000 households, and the run-of-river development option was quite a few households. So the analysis of alternatives, basically, we consider the run-of-river development option as being the preferred option from a social point of view because of limited and manageable involuntary resettlement near Rusumo Falls. We considered that both the intermediate and full development options would lead to significant resettlement. And in 3 countries, it would be difficult to manage because of the lack of available land, local instability, conflicts, and weak legal and institutional capacity. The problem we faced was that the intermediary development option was considered acceptable from the technical, economic, and environmental perspectives, as it would allow for a certain amount of reservoir storage and for maintenance of minimum downstream environmental flows, while social feasibility still remained in question. So what happened? So when I finished working on this part of the Rusumo Falls program, we had a meeting with energy ministers in Arusha, in Tanzania, to present the conclusions of our study. And on the basis of the debates, working with the engineering firm who was coordinating this, the decision of the consultant was to propose with a final feasibility design on the intermediate development scheme. Well, the full supply level that would maximize live storage, power production, and wouldn't modify the natural water surface level of Lake Ruweru in order to limit socioeconomic impacts. So this was sort of a compromise, and I actually was very angry with the team and with the consultants. So actually behind the scenes, there was a lot of yelling and screaming and debating. I felt that I had been betrayed by the environmental coordinator. So anyway, it was an interesting context, and we presented this, right? So what happened after? What happened after is the countries concerned decided to reject the consultant's recommendation, and the World Bank supported them. And so the conclusion out of all this process was that that the studies should continue, but on the basis of the full development scheme with a full supply level, even if it would have extensive socioeconomic impacts, including on fishing villages in Lake Ruweru. And that's how it was going to move forward. So the bank agreed actually with this decision, and they argued that actually with the expertise of the World Bank, they could help these countries manage this resettlement. They had the capacity and everything to do it. I withdrew from the project at that moment, so I didn't think it would be feasible. So what happened in the end? The final country and bank decision, so there were these studies that were carried out, detailed studies to demonstrate that in fact the resettlement, the full development scheme was impossible. They faced all kinds of technical problems. The scope of resettlement was much worse even than it had been perceived in our studies when you went into all the details of the marshlands, etc. And there was a political process. So first there was this technical problems they were facing, that the full development scheme just didn't make sense technically. It became too expensive, the cost of resettlement. It wasn't even sure if it was feasible. At the same time, there were also environmental groups and NGOs that were saying it didn't make sense to do a full development scheme. So there was a discussion that happened finally between the World Bank and the countries concerned that if they wanted the project to be funded, the only way they could do it was with a run-of-river scheme, with minimal resettlement. So that's what was decided. The final studies that were done on the project were based on a run-of-river scheme. And the project was finally approved by the bank and is under construction now. So I thought it gives you an interesting view of how these things are planned out. Sometimes it can take a long time and go in many different directions before. So the final, there's a table here that summarizes the final impacts. You see, without the LiDAR surveys for the run-of-river scheme, we estimated about 70 households would be affected. With the details, there was still 685 households affected. So that's another lesson we've learned on many, many projects, is when the more you know about a project, the more households there are to resettle. Also, so the conclusion on this is basically what the resulting of the Rusumo Falls project is basically a sustainable project, as it's enabled for minimization of resettlement. The social constraints were finally recognized. Full compensation for lost assets were provided to the affected households close to the dam. It was done before startup of construction. Livelihood restoration programs for the affected households are being put in place based on the interest of each household in terms of training, financial assistance. and they're supported by local district authorities. It only concerns 2 countries now as a run-of-river project. Burundi is not affected. And the ecological flows are ensured downstream. And there's a Ramsar site that has been established upstream on Lake Rweru to support the development of viable fisheries, of sustainable fisheries on Lake Rweru. So it's designed now as a sustainable project. So that's my first presentation. I don't know if I run out completely of time. Okay. Okay. So basically, you see the logic of this is how you plan hydropower projects now. Is going from upstream all the way down to construction, and it can follow many complicated political paths. What I wanted to discuss briefly with you is another approach that was developed in Canada on the James Bay Hydro Power Complex. So we're talking about a much greater scale of hydropower development. The complex about 5,000 to 6,000 megawatts. And Hydro-Quebec, in about the beginning of years 2000, wanted to develop the 3rd phase of the James Bay complex. They wanted to close it out with a huge final hydropower development. They recognized at the time that there was no way they could build the 3rd phase of the James Bay complex without getting agreement with the Cree indigenous communities who lived in the lands concerned, right? So basically, they came to an agreement with the indigenous communities on starting up a process that could lead to the development of the planning of the 3rd phase of hydropower development. And the indigenous communities, what they required to get there was to fix the problems of the past. So the James Bay Hydropower Complex was actually built starting from 1975. It's a bit similar to Menantieli in the way that when the first dams were built, environmental studies didn't exist. It was, it was before the more modern processes in environmental social assessment. And so the Cree communities, they insisted that there were plenty of problems caused by these hydropower projects in the past, going back to 1975. Hydro-Quebec specialists or engineers didn't see what the problems were, but there was an agreement to sit down and discuss what the problems were. So go back into the past. And once these problems had been clearly identified, to try find ways to fix them, to provide corrective measures. And that would serve as a basis for discussions for future development of hydropower planning. So I was involved for 5 years in this study from 2000 to 2005, which was known as a post-project socioeconomic assessment of the hydropower, La Grande hydropower complex on indigenous communities. There were 2 consultants involved. There was a social and economic consultant, which was our firm, and there was an archaeological consultant. There was a very specialized in archaeology and historical anthropology. So we were working more on the social community impacts and economic impacts, while the archaeological firm was working more on developing detailed maps of the hydroelectric complex before the hydroelectric complex with the indigenous communities. So they had 2 separate detailed maps they were developing from 30 years back and now to compare. There was also a collaborative structure and process that was established for the study, so I'll just describe that for you. So this is an example of a community, First Nation of Mistissini, the biggest community in the James Bay where I worked a lot. As you see, the houses are pretty nice because they made quite a lot of money also from these hydroelectric developments. Pretty barren landscapes, often in the winter. So I think I explained the context. So we're talking about 9 Cree indigenous communities that are affected, about 13,000 people, a relatively small population, but basically they occupied these lands and they made use, and they still make use of these lands in northern Quebec, which are a giant territory, for hunting, fishing, traditional activities, trapping, etc. There was in 1975, there was a legal agreement, which is known as the JBNQA, that was agreed to once the Cree community sued the Quebec government for proposing it to build the hydroelectric complex. Among the benefits that came from this agreement was what's known as the Cree Hunters and Trappers Income Support Program, where basically, because the Cree communities were concerned about the fact that the flooding of part of their lands would affect their traditional livelihoods, they got agreement through this legal agreement that hunters and trappers would be subsidized about 200 days per year to spend their time hunting and fishing and trapping inland, because also there's issues about the collapse of fur markets to enable them to keep on having a traditional way of life, subsidized way of life. So I think I covered this. Maybe one element for the post-project assessment also was a condition for government approval of the last projects that have been built previously, that there be this post-project assessment carried out. So how it was set up, there was a joint study steering committee set up with representatives of Hydro-Quebec and the concerned Cree communities. The study was done in 2 phases again, first in the eastern part, which was developed earlier, and then in the western part of the complex in order to keep the study manageable. And also what was really interesting is that this joint steering committee, they agreed, but the part of their role was agreeing on the methodology. So I remember I was working with Hydro-Quebec. They proposed a methodology for doing this post-project assessment, and the representatives of the Cree communities completely changed the methodology. They didn't agree with the approach. So that was an interesting part of the process also. So the steering committee set out the study objectives. Community coordinators were recruited to assist in setting up meetings with study participants, leaders, elders, trappers, and in validating the study reports with participants. There were informed consent procedures and rules of confidentiality, which were jointly defined, which is very important. And so what we were looking at was basically, to go back a little bit to Dolores's presentation before, one of the methodological challenges we faced was distinguishing between massive social changes and impacts of the complex, right? Which is 2 very different things. In particular, for the Cree indigenous communities in the 50s and 60s, their lifestyle was a little bit like a Paleolithic lifestyle, right? They were literally living off the land. And during the period from 1975 to 2000, they had jumped brutally into the 21st century, right? So it's extreme social changes that they had gone through. And then the challenge in the study was distinguishing between these extreme social changes on the one hand and what was directly linked to hydroelectric development on the other hand. And also, so the question also, we wanted to focus on the performance of the mitigation measures that had been put into place to deal with environmental social issues and to identify corrective measures. And the themes that were covered were past and current Indigenous, non-Indigenous land uses, including the establishment of baseline maps, economic aspects, including traditional land uses, and social aspects, including community impacts. This took a long time. So the study outcomes, it documented the evolution of Cree land use activities over a period of 30 years, following the transformation of their lands by the creation of vast reservoirs that you actually can see from space quite clear. They're huge reservoirs. And the building of extensive networks of access roads. And it documented the conflicts raised by increased non-Indigenous uses of the land, forestry, mining, sports hunting and fishing, etc. Did I jump? It also documented the community impacts associated with 30 years of modernization, the increased cost of traditional hunting and trapping, and declining incomes. And it led to the identification of a number of corrective measures to be put into place. So what kind of corrective measures? There was building roads, access ramps, weirs, portages, navigation channels, boat landings, and navigation maps, which was actually one way to address the fact that the reservoirs had totally changed their landscapes and the ways they could access their territories. They're also facing people coming up from the south to steal their materials on their lands. So they're included putting in place storage facilities to protect hunting materials, developing wildlife management areas, clearing of dead trees and debris, and seeding, and making adjustments to the income security program for hunters. So the conclusions in terms of social redress was that the corrective measures were actually funded and put into place to address legacy issues. So there is both a recognition on the part of the communities and of Hydro-Quebec that the problems had been identified and were being corrected. And it had a big impact on the planning of future projects. There's a new collaborative approach to hydropower project planning that led to the development of Phase 3 of the Lagon complex. There's a giant project, the East Main 1A Dam and Rupert River Diversion Project that was developed from 2005 to 2010-12. I was responsible for the social impact assessment for that project, so that went ahead. As part of the changes that happened when we're talking about collaborative approach, for example, at Hydro-Quebec, it was agreed with the communities that the planning of the new Phase 3 would be done in a very different way. It would bring to the table trappers working with the engineers to agree on how to design the project, where to locate weirs. Interestingly, is when this approach was proposed to the engineers inside Hydro-Quebec, most of them refused. They say this out of the question. So they were retired, or tablettés was a French word, was put on a shelf, and they were replaced by younger engineers who just come out of university or more open to new approaches to designing hydro projects and sitting down with trappers and hunters who were perceived as being ignorant but actually knew a lot about the territory. They were amazing, actually, the trappers. They could look at giant topo maps where all you see is green and blue and just lines, and they could read in detail where they were on these topo maps when I had no idea. It's very confusing. So that's it. There's a different way of planning projects based on this. It also had this study had interesting impacts on the transmission of cultural heritage to future generations. Hydro-Quebec, basically, they funded huge reports with giant maps and a lot of information from elders on trap lines, on hunting territories. And for the Cree School Board, this was fantastic materials to be provided to students in schools. So it was used to develop training materials and put stuff in the computers that all the children had in their classes but had nothing to put in the computers. So it was interesting also. There are a number of elders who participated in the studies who died a little time after the studies. So it was a way of actually getting testimonials and videos and photos and etc. of the past life and the new life from these elders. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vincent, for a wonderful presentation. So for a social scientist, and that includes me, it's a really lucky privilege to see how planners decide, okay, do we displace 10,000 or do we just keep it to a few hundred? And then we're talking of human beings. And of course, the other things is, which I did not include when I gave the introduction, that yes, there are new techniques in dam, including run of the river, where you don't completely block the water, and participatory approach to planning projects, as we learned. And these have been learned by making mistakes as we moved along. We take a break for 15 minutes. We reconvene at 4:45, and the next two presenters will be shifting it completely to opposition to projects and mobilization for better resettlement and how that unfolds. At the end of the other two presentations, we'll then have a Q&A session, and I hope that you'll all be back to join us for that as well. So see you in 15 minutes. Thanks.